Hey class, and welcome to chapter 6, which is covering learning and behavior. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is just defining learning. So it says here that learning is relatively enduring change in potential behavior that results from experience. There are three really important elements to this definition. The first element is change. Most learning tends to produce lasting changes in the behavior of the learner. Secondly, the definition excludes changes in behavior that result from anything other than experience. For example, behavior can be modified by non-experiential events like diseases, injury, or maturation. And the third element speaks of potential behavior, which is although learning causes changes in behavior, it is not always reflected directly in performance. The absence of observable behavior change does not necessarily mean that no learning has taken place. However, a change in behavior under the appropriate conditions must be observable at some time to claim that learning has occurred. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about associative learning, which learning by making an association between two stimulus events, which is Pavlovian conditioning, or by learning an association between a response and its consequence, which is operant conditioning. So Pavlovian conditioning, which is also referred to as classical conditioning, involves learning that takes place when a neutral stimulus, a CS, is paired with a stimulus, a UCS, that already produces a response, a UCR. Okay, so a neutral stimulus is a CS, which is also a conditioned stimulus. The UCS is the unconditioned stimulus, and the UCR is the unconditioned response. After conditioning, the organism responds to the neutral stimulus in some way, and the response to the CS is called a conditioned response, a CR. So an example of this would be the flavor of the unique dish at the restaurant becomes associated with illness. A small child learns to associate the sight of a physician's syringe with the discomfort of an injection, or bears learn to associate painful shocks with humans. And we'll talk more about this coming up here a little bit later. Operant conditioning is learning an association between one's behavior and its consequence, reinforcement or punishment. And template learning, learning that depends on a particular type of perceptual experience during a critical time in development. Examples of this include imprinting and language learning. It's called template learning because there appears to be a neural template that facilitates it. Okay, and first now we're going to go back to Pavlov. Okay, so you might have even heard about Pavlov. Pavlov is the guy who started realizing that he could make dogs salivate by first ringing a bell before giving them their food. So the dogs started to learn that the ringing of the bell signified they were about to get fed, which then made them have the response of salivating. There's another really good example of Pavlovian conditioning on page 223, the story about a student returning to a biology class after taking a year off and having her first child. And when she walks into the biology lab, she has an overwhelming experience of terror, feels like she can't breathe, all of these things that have never happened to her before when she was in school. And turns out that she had to have, it was a high-risk delivery and she had to have a cesarean section. And so now she, in her brain, associates the smell of the classroom, the biology room, with the smell of the hospital. So it brought back that feeling of anxiety. So that's another example. So Ivan Pavlov was actually studying the physiological mechanisms involved in digestion when he figured this out about this conditioning. So he did a surgical procedure in each of these dogs, which exposed their salivation glands and also measured the flow of their saliva. So Pavlov would present a stimulus, meat powder. When food entered the dog's mouth, the immediate result was the natural reflexive response of salivation. However, Pavlov soon noticed that his dogs began to salivate to stimuli other than food in their mouths. For example, they might start salivating when they saw the experimenter because they would associate that with the food. The sound of Pavlov's footsteps or the sight of the food dish also caused salivation. So this discovery sort of changed the course of his study, and he now began to investigate how other stimuli could cause dogs to salivate. His experiments are generally recognized as the first systematic study of learning, and the processes that he outlined came to be called primary conditioning. Pavlovian conditioning is also called classical conditioning because Pavlov described it as conditioning of the classical type. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more in detail about these different stimuli that are part of Pavlovian conditioning. So first we have our unconditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus in this experiment is that meat causes dogs to salivate. Okay, so this is a stimulus that elicits an unlearned response or reflex. This is not learned, okay? This is just a natural reflex. Meat equals salivation. Then we have the unconditioned response, or the UCR. And in Pavlovian conditioning, an unlearned response or reflex caused by an unconditioned stimulus. So again, back to this experiment, salivating at the presentation of meat is an automatic response that does not require learning. Okay, so the stimulus is the meat. The unconditioned response is the salivating at the presentation of meat, because that hasn't been learned. That's just a biological response. Then we have the conditioned stimulus, or the CS. And in Pavlovian conditioning, a stimulus that elicits its response only after being associated with an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so back to our experiment, the bell initially is a neutral stimulus in that it does not elicit the to-be-learned response by itself. So when Pavlov started this experiment, if he had just rang the bell, the dogs would not have salivated, okay? It's been a conditioned stimulus when he included the bell in relation and association to the meat, okay? So then we have our conditioned response, or the CR, and this is a learned response to a conditioned stimulus. So this is Pavlov's dogs were conditioned to salivate when a bell sounded. This is the conditioned response from the conditioned stimulus. And here we have a diagram drawing of what this looked like. So here you have your dog, and here you have the salivation gland, and here's where the amount of saliva is being measured, and here's where they would be fed. Okay, so before conditioning, we have our unconditioned stimulus, meat, response, salivation, unconditioned response, okay? Then we have the tuning fork being the neutral stimulus, response, nothing. No salivation, no conditioned response. Then during conditioning, we have a tuning fork, food, and the response is salivation, an unconditioned response again, okay? Because there's the food involved here. Then after conditioning, we have the conditioned stimulus, which used to be the neutral stimulus, and the response is the salivation, which is now a conditioned response. So let's talk a little bit more here about differentiation between the UCR and the CR. I'm just going to go back here a slide. Okay, so the UCR in Pavlov's, or what's the UCR, remember, is unconditioned response. In Pavlov's experiments occurred when the dog salivated in response to meat, and the CR was also salivation. However, the UCR and the CR may be quite different depending on both the nature of the CS and the UCS, okay? Okay, so that's a little bit more in depth about how to differentiate between the UCS and the CR. oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, between the unconditioned response and the conditioned response, okay? Um, and a little bit more to unconditioned. This is really good to know. Unconditioned and conditioned responses differ in their intensity. An unconditioned response is generally more intense than is a response that has been conditioned. So an example of this would be that a dog, even after it's been conditioned, will have more saliva in their mouths when meat is actually placed in their mouths than they will when they hear a bell ring. Okay? So acquisition of it's so hard for me to say, I'm sorry. Pavlovian conditioning. So acquisition. In Pavlovian conditioning, the process of learning to associate a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. And in operant conditioning, the process of learning to associate responses with a reinforcer or a punisher. So conditioning takes place more easily when the neutral or conditioned stimulus is clearly different from other stimuli. For instance, had Pavlov signaled the arrival of food by quietly humming a Russian ballad, his dogs might have never perceived the connection, since such sounds are commonplace and might not have been noticed. So the more clearly the conditioned stimulus is presented, and the easier it is to differentiate from other stimuli, the better conditioning will take place. Also, the intensity of the unconditioned stimulus will also influence conditioning, as will the frequency with which the CS and the UCS are paired. Okay, so that's just clear. For instance, if you had a really delicious T-bone steak versus some dry dog food, the intensity of the UCS would be more with the steak, right? So that's kind of what that's talking about. Also, the degree to which the CS and the UCS are related will also influence the acquisition. Okay, so frequent pairings generally facilitate conditioning. If bells were only occasionally accompanied by feeding, Pavlov's dogs would have been less likely to be conditioned, and that makes sense. So stimulus contingency and conditioning. We have another guy here, Rescorla, and he figured out by exposing rats to one of two conditioning procedures, either a stimulus contingent procedure or a non-contingent procedure. So a stimulus contingent procedure is a series of CS's and UCS's, tones and shocks, were presented, but a UCS shock never occurred unless the tone preceded it. The presentation of the UCS was contingent upon a CS preceding it, okay? And then a non-contingent procedure. The same number of CS and UCS presentations occurred. However, the presentations of the CS and the UCS were independent. The presentation of the UCS was not contingent upon a CS preceding it. So let's talk a little bit more clearly here about this experiment. So in the stimulus contingent procedure, a series of CS's and UCS tones and shocks were presented, but a shock never occurred unless a CS preceded it. Okay, so tone and shocks, but a shock never occurred unless a tone came first. So the presentation of the shock was contingent upon the tone preceding it. Okay. Occasionally, however, the tones were presented without being followed by a shock. And in the non-contingent procedure, the same number of CS and UCS presentations occurred. However, the presentations of the CS and UCS were independent. That is, the presentation of a shock was not contingent upon the prior occurrence of a tone. Okay? So here you can see how These are contingent here, right? You have your tone and your shock, and then non-contingent. So these are functioning independent of each other, as you can see. So interestingly enough, when Rescorla tested both groups for conditioning, just going to back up here, he found that conditioning only occurred for the rats in the stimulus contingent procedure. No learning occurred with the non-contingent procedure. So this is important because it demonstrates that more than occasional CS-UCS pairings are necessary for conditioning, as Pavlov's and his followers believed. So Pavlov actually believed that occasional pairings of the CS and UCS were sufficient for conditioning, and therefore some conditioning should have taken place during the non-contingent procedure. But that's not what happened. So good to know that it has to be more than just occasional. See how in this one there's like occasional lining up here in this non-contingent, but here every time. So it's got to be, it has to work together. It's got to be contingent in order for learning to take place. If it's random, learning will not take place. Conditioning will not take place. Okay? So timing and conditioning. Conditioning occurs most easily when the CS is presented just moments before the UCS appears, and it is continued until after the presentation of the UCS. So for example, the bell rings before food is presented to Pavlov's dog, and it continues until the animal begins to salivate as food enters its mouth. The timing in this sequence is called delayed conditioning, okay? Typically, delays between 0.5 and 2 seconds are optimal. When timing is varied, conditioning can still take place. So for instance, simultaneous conditioning takes place when the conditioned stimulus is presented at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus. Okay? Then we also have trace conditioning, which is the conditioned stimulus begins and ends before the unconditioned stimulus is presented. So in Pavlovian conditioning, here we have it, learning that takes place when presentation of the conditioned stimulus begins and ends before the unconditioned stimulus. And then we have backward conditioning, okay? Backward conditioning, the UCS is presented prior to the CS. And delayed conditionings with short CS-UCS intervals generally yield the most rapid rate of learning. And in contrast, the least effective is backward conditioning, which usually results in little or no learning. Okay, so here we have a diagram of the timing. Here we have delayed conditioning. Hopefully you can see this is a little maybe out of your screen. Okay, here we have simultaneous conditioning. It's happening at the same time. Trace conditioning is here, and then backward conditioning, which is not effective. So conditioned taste aversions, also sometimes called the Garcia effect. So because John Garcia was the first to study conditioned taste aversions, and what this is a learned aversion to a relatively novel taste or smell that occurs following illness or nausea. This is quite common for individuals who have undergone chemo or radiation therapy for cancer. Good example of this, John Garcia's experiment. Rats were first exposed to a novel taste, in this case saccharin. Several hours later, the rats were exposed to moderate doses of radiation, which made them ill. To test for conditioning, the rats were given access to 2 drinking spouts, one containing plain water and the other saccharin solution. Normally, rats would prefer the saccharin solution to water because it was sweet, but these conditioned rats do not. The lack of a saccharin preference is what's called the conditioned taste aversion. Okay, so here we go. Extinction and reinstatement. So in extinction, The process by which a conditioned response is eliminated through repeated presentation of the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so then we have also reinstatement, and this is the reappearance of a conditioned response after extinction has taken place. So, for instance, the Pavlovian conditioned response of salivating to a bell may have been established only after numerous pairings or trials. So after extinction, the conditioned response could come back, okay? So let's talk a little more clearly here about extinction. So if you go back to Pavlov and his dogs, if you took away the meat, right, if you just used that bell and you chimed that bell and never gave them the food, they would over time not salivate any longer when they heard that bell, okay? What's interesting though is reinstatement. If you bring back the conditioned response after extinction has taken place, it takes much less time to acquire the conditioning again than it did the first time. So that's interesting. Okay, so here we have acquisition, extinction, and reinstatement. Okay, so here you can see the acquisition phase. Okay, and then here it peters out into extinction and then arrest, and then see where it starts again here, reinstatement. Okay, so much easier to bring it back than it was to initially introduce that conditioning. Stimulus, generalization, and discrimination. Okay, so generalization is a process by which an organism responds to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus without undergoing conditioning for each similar stimulus. How many times can you say stimulus? Okay, so for example, Pavlov's dogs may have salivated to a variety of similar bell sounds when they were given their food. Okay, so because they all sound pretty much the same, the bell sounds, they would all salivate even if it wasn't the exact same sound every time. Okay. But just as a learned response may generalize to similar situations, it can also be restricted, and this is discrimination. So in classical and operant conditioning, the process by which responses are restricted to specific stimuli. In social psychology, the behavioral consequence of prejudice in which one group is treated differently from another group. Okay? An example of this would be if somebody comes back from a war and they're experiencing some post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms from that. And so because they're scared when they hear something that sounds like a gunshot going off, right? Every time a car backfires when they first get back, they could have that trauma reaction because it's similar to the sound of a gunshot. However, with time, through discrimination, these people can learn to differentiate between the sound of a car backfiring and the sound of a bullet whizzing by. Okay? We also have second order conditioning. So this is kind of a step further from classical conditioning. So this is a learned association between two conditioned stimuli that can occur following conditioning to CS1 and an unconditioned stimulus. Okay? So, for example, if a salient tone, being CS1, is repeatedly paired with a mild shock, being the UCS, the tone will come to elicit fear, which is the conditioned response. Now, if light, let's call that CS2, is paired with the tone, CS1, for several trials, it will elicit a fear response when presented alone. Okay? So essentially, just taking it another step further and attaching a second CS2 conditioned stimulus in with the CS1, all right? Okay, so here we go. Here's a good diagram for it. Okay, so here we have first order conditioning, okay? So a bell, which is CS1, is paired with meat, which is the UCS, okay? So here we have providing meat results in salivation, okay? Sounding a bell, no response. Then the conditioning, here we have sounding a bell followed by the meat and then the salivation. And then after conditioning, sounding a bell, salivation, okay? We went over that one before. So now, taking it a step further, second order conditioning. So before conditioning, we have sounding a bell results in salivation, okay? From up here, it's just carrying this forward, okay? Then we put in sounding a tone results in no response because this is a new conditioned stimulus, okay? Then during conditioning, we put sounding a tone followed by sounding a bell, and then we get salivation because this conditioned response, or sorry, this conditioned stimuli has already produced this conditioned response. Pretty soon, sounding a tone will result in salivation, okay? Second order conditioning. Okay, so operant conditioning takes place when behavior is influenced by its consequences, all right? And for beginning to speak about operant conditioning, we're going to be talking about Thorndike's your man, Edward Thorndike, okay? So this is happening at about the same time that Pavlov was investigating involuntary reflexive responses. Thorndike was analyzing the effects of stimuli on voluntary operant behavior, okay? So he believes that animals learn to make voluntary responses that help them adapt to their environment, all right? And just really quickly, really important thing about operant conditioning is we're talking here now about voluntary responses, okay, versus reflexive responses. So I hope everybody's clear on that. Pavlov's dealing with reflex, okay? Salivating's reflexive. It's not something that we consciously decide to do, right? It just happens. Voluntary responses are different. Involuntary responses are something that we're cognitively deciding to do, okay? So Thorndike's experiment here involved designing a device called a puzzle box, and he placed hungry cats in wooden boxes lashed from the inside. Outside, he dangled a piece of fish in full view. The cats howled, meowed, clawed, and frantically explored in their attempts to get out of the box. Eventually, they accidentally tripped the latch and gained access to the food. The next time the cats found themselves inside the box, they repeated some of the same trial and error behavior as before, but they generally took less time to escape from the box. So with each additional trial, the cat's actions became less variable until they learned to trip the latch immediately. And Thorndike explained this by suggesting that behavior will be strengthened if it is followed by a positive consequence. And alternatively, behavior that does not lead to a satisfying consequence will be eliminated. So throughout this experiment, Thorndike is seeing that the cat's behaviors that weren't helping them get to that reward soon became weeded out. So things like clawing at the walls and howling ceased to occur because they aren't the things that produced the food. Okay? So this is how he formulated the law of effect, which is the theory originally produced by Edward Thorndike that is the foundation of the operant conditioning theory, which is behavior followed by reinforcement will be strengthened, while behavior followed by punishment will be weakened. Okay? Thorndike's puzzle box is why the term operant has been applied to this type of learning. Simply because his cats learned to operate on their environment in a manner that resulted in satisfaction. Okay? Another way of saying this would be that their behaviors were instrumental in achieving a positive outcome. So this conditioning model can also be called instrumental conditioning. Whoa, sorry. Let's go back here. Okay, Thorndike followed up by monumental contributions by Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner. Okay, Skinner's research spanned several decades, and it provided much of what we now know about operant conditioning. So let's talk about operant conditioning in a Skinner box. Okay, here we go. Here's a picture of a Skinner box. Okay, So a hungry rat is placed in a box and it's empty. This box is empty except for a bar protruding from one wall with a small food dish directly beneath it. After a short time in a Skinner box, the rat begins to examine its surroundings. As it explores, it eventually approaches the bar. When the rat is near the bar, a food pellet is released into the dish. The next bar approach, followed immediately by food delivery, occurs after some additional exploration. Soon, the rat spends most of its time around the bar. Next, the rat must contact and exert some force on the bar before food is delivered. As with approaching the bar, this activity soon becomes predominant. The operant response of bar pressing is selected by the food it produces, and the rate of pressing steadily increases. Okay? So here you go. Here's your little rat. Here's your Skinner box. There's a little bar. Here's where his little food comes out. Okay, so also, reinforcement acts to select or guide behavior. Okay? The rat in Skinner's box spends most of its time pressing a lever, not because the association between lever pressing and food was strengthened, but because it is the effective response and the other ineffective responses have dropped out. Okay? That's what Skinner is saying here. And the way that we measure operant behavior is with a cumulative record. And this is a chart recording operant responses over time. So what this looks like is a recording pen rests on paper that moves slowly at a fixed rate. Each time an animal makes an operant response, such as pressing a bar, the pen moves up a fixed distance and then continues on its horizontal path. The more frequently an animal responds, the more rapidly the pen climbs up the chart. Okay? So here we go. Here's a cumulative record. Okay? So you can see here's climbing, okay? Paused and recording, climbing, climbing, climbing. Pen is reset, okay? Climbing, climbing, climbing. Pen moves up to record the response. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so discriminative stimuli. In operant conditioning, a stimulus that controls a response by signaling the availability of reinforcement, okay? Going back to our little picture here of our Skinner box, you might have noticed that there's this little light here, okay? So Skinner used this light to introduce a new variable, setting the dispenser to deliver food only when both the bar is pressed and the light is on. When the light is off, no food is delivered. Under these conditions of differential reinforcement, reinforcement which takes place only under certain circumstances, the rat soon learns to make the appropriate discrimination. It presses the bar only when the light is on. Okay? So in this example, the light serves as the discriminative stimulus. Okay? Okay, reinforcement. In operant conditioning, any procedure where an event following a specific response increases the probability that the response will occur. Pretty clear, okay? That pretty much makes sense. Positive reinforcement. In operant conditioning, any stimulus presented after a response that increases the probability of the response. Negative reinforcement. In operant conditioning, any stimulus that increases the probability of a response through its removal. Okay? So this is important to know because sometimes people get negative reinforcement mixed up with punishment. Okay? And just think about it like this. Positive reinforcement, think of the rat pushing that bar to get a food pellet. Okay? That rat is gaining something. Okay? Going for something. A negative reinforcement is also something that you want to happen, but it's the removal of something, okay? So in positive reinforcement, you're gaining something. In negative reinforcement, you're getting rid of something, okay? So for instance, pounding on the wall may be maintained by the termination of loud noise in an adjoining room, okay? So now we're going to talk a little bit more about some different procedures used to study negative reinforcement. What we've talked about so far has really been positive reinforcement. Okay, so escape conditioning. So an example of this would be a rat is placed in a Skinner box, the floor of which consists of a metal grid that can be electrified. A mild current is activated. As the rat tries to escape, it bumps into a bar, and the shocking current immediately ceases. The pattern is repeated several times until the rat remains poised by the bar, ready to press it at the first jolt. Okay? So what's happening here is the shock, which is an unpleasant stimulus, may be terminated only by the appropriate operant response. Okay? Then we have avoidance conditioning. This is modifying the escape conditioning by introducing a warning signal, which allows the rat to avoid the shock altogether. So going back to the idea of the light, if the light goes on a few seconds prior to each shock, the rat soon learns to respond to this discriminative stimulus by pressing the bar in time to avoid the shock. Okay? Primary and conditioned reinforcers. A primary reinforcer in operant conditioning is a stimulus that satisfies a biologically based drive, such as hunger, thirst, or sleep. A conditioned reinforcer is a stimulus that takes on reinforcing properties after being associated with a primary enforcer. Okay? So sort of similar to in our classical conditioning, right? The primary reinforcer is like the meat. The conditioned reinforcer is a little bit like the bell in that this the meat satisfies a biologically based drive all on its own, right? The conditioned reinforcer, the bell, made the dog salivate and associated it with something that it wanted, the meat, right? And that's how it became a conditioned reinforcer, okay? Other conditioned reinforcers are words of praise, good grades, and money. Much of our behavior is influenced more by conditioned reinforcement than by biologically significant primary reinforcement, okay? We also have continuous versus partial reinforcement. So if each occurrence of a specific behavior is reinforced, okay, this is continuous reinforcement. That makes sense. Every time it happens, it's reinforced, okay? Partial reinforcement exists when behavior is reinforced only part of the time, hence the word partial, okay? There are striking differences between the effects of continuous and partial reinforcement schedules on behavior. Continuous reinforcement schedules almost always produce the highest rate of acquisition of a new behavior, okay? Makes sense. Every time it happens, it's being reinforced, okay? Behaviors that are acquired on partial instead of continuous schedules are slower to be established. However, what's interesting is that these behaviors are remarkably more persistent when no reinforcement is provided. For example, a rat accustomed to only intermittent reinforcement for bar pressing continues to press long after the food dispenser has run dry. Okay? This is known as the partial reinforcement effect. Partial reinforcement effect is broken down into different schedules. Okay? The first one's a ratio schedule. A certain percentage of responses receive reinforcement. Then we have an interval schedule, which is time-based. Subjects are reinforced for their first response after a certain amount of time has passed. There's a variable schedule reinforcement. This is delivered unpredictably. And a fixed schedule reinforcement is always delivered after a constant number of responses or a fixed interval of time. Okay, a good example of a fixed ratio schedule would be a rat receives a food pellet after 12 bar presses, okay? Or a strawberry picker receives $1 after filling 12 small boxes with berries, okay? Sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself, aren't I? Yep. Okay, let's go back over here and look at this. Okay, here we have schedules of reinforcement. Okay, so here is our first, which is a fixed ratio. Okay, you can clearly see that there's a fixed ratio here. It's all the same. Okay, then we have a variable ratio schedule, meaning that it's just random. Okay, variable ratio. Then we have a fixed interval. So the intervals are happening in equal spans of time here. And then we have a varied interval. Same thing. Okay? Okay, fixed ratio schedule, partial reinforcement. I just went over this, okay? A variable ratio schedule is partial reinforcement and operant conditioning, wherein a reinforcement is provided after an average of specific number of responses occur. Okay, so this is what's happening in gambling, interestingly enough. Okay? For example, a person who always bets 13 at the roulette wheel is on a variable ratio schedule of VR38. The wheel has 36 numbers plus 0 and 0, 0. On the average, 13 comes up 38 spins. However, during a hot streak, 13 might occur 3 times in 20 spins, or not at all. Okay? Similarly, a slot machine may be rigged to pay off once every 20 times a coin is deposited, on the average. The gambler does not know when it will turn a few coins it has swallowed. It is the unpredictable, highly variable nature of these payoffs that make gambling so compelling to some people. Okay? Very interesting. Then we have a fixed interval schedule. Okay? Reinforcement is provided for the first response after a specified period of time has elapsed. For example, a rat on an F130 schedule whose bar press has just produced a food pellet will receive its next reinforcer the first time it bar presses after 30 seconds have elapsed. Okay? Variable ratio schedule, partial reinforcement schedule and operant conditioning where opportunities for reinforcement occur at variable time intervals. So this is repeatedly checking your email is rewarded when you actually receive an email. Okay? Okay, so let's talk a little bit here about shaping. So shaping is a technique in which responses that are increasingly similar to the desired behavior are reinforced step by step until the desired behavior occurs. Learning of speech by a young child is shaped from nonsensical babbling to closer and closer approximations of the appropriate sounds of words. Okay? Shaping can be really effective when working with autistic children and helping them to gain rewards for trying behaviors that get closer and closer and closer to the desired one. Those of you in this class, I know there's quite a few who work with horses, right? It's like that. When you're teaching your horse something new and they make one small step in that direction, that's when you reward them, right? That's when you might end for the day, your training session, and then the next day you're building on that, and you're building and building and building. That's shaping, okay? Modeling is a learning process wherein an individual requires a behavior by observing somebody else performing that behavior. This is also known as observational learning, okay? Athletic skills such as diving, hitting a tennis ball, or riding a skateboard are more easily learned by watching someone else or watching your own performance. Okay, that's modeling. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit here about punishment. So, punishment is a procedure in which the presentation of a stimulus following a response leads to a decrease in the strength or frequency of the response. This can involve the withdrawal of pleasurable activities, but not always associated with physical punishment, such as spanking. Okay? So punishment can also just be taking away something pleasurable. It doesn't have to be physically spanking or physical punishment. Okay? So we're going to talk a little bit more about punishment. It's pretty interesting here, what we've learned about punishment. So there are some pretty clear limitations of punishment. One limitation is long-term effectiveness. So punishment suppresses behavior but does not eliminate it. And suppressed behavior may reemerge when the prospect of punishment is gone or sharply curtailed. There's also an emotional side effect here. So punishment can cause fear and aggression of the teacher, okay? And this fear and aggression may generalize over time. It can also just teach someone how to avoid the punishment, right? Not actually teach them right from wrong. And this may model aggressive behaviors of the teacher. So considerable evidence suggests that youngsters who are punished physically learn to model or imitate these aggressive acts and often become more aggressive in their interactions with others. Thus, parents who spank or hit misbehaving children may be teaching them more than is intended, that physical aggression is acceptable and that it typically gets the aggressor what they want. Okay? Talking about generalization, if you have a little kid who struggles in class and they get in trouble in their class, they can start to hate school, right, and not want to go to school at all. So that's what that's talking about there. There are advantages of doing punishment correctly, okay? Most psychologists do not advocate total abolition of all punishment for controlling or modifying behavior. Reinforcement is preferable in most cases, but punishment is sometimes essential as a way to suppress undesirable actions so that a desirable alternative behavior might occur. Okay? Punishment also can be the only practical method to train your dog to refrain from barking at night, right? Sometimes it's needed. Some things about punishment, though, to make it effective: it works best when it is immediate, consistent, and strong enough to accomplish the desired goal of suppressing undesirable behavior. So, like, timeouts for your little kids should be 5 to 10 minutes, not hours and hours and hours, okay? If punishment is not consistent, it loses its effectiveness, okay? And inconsistencies can occur over time or from one person to another. That's like, two parents. One is stricter than the other one, right? The kid is quickly going to learn to go to the less strict parent. And that punishment hasn't been consistent, so it's not going to be successful in changing that undesirable behavior. Okay. Before we talk about this slide that I have brought up here, I just want to talk a little bit too about the differences in Pavlovian and operant conditioning. I know I mentioned this earlier, okay, but Pavlovian conditioning involves learning associations between a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. Operant conditioning involves learning associations between behavior and its consequences, reinforcement or punishment, okay? More specifically, the procedures of Pavlovian and operant conditioning differ, okay? In Pavlovian conditioning, experiments, the researcher typically presents two stimuli: a novel CS immediately preceding the UCS, which naturally elicits some response, okay? After several paired presentations of these stimuli, the researcher can test for a conditioned response by presenting the CS alone, okay? Secondly, and even more importantly, the kinds of responses for operant and Pavlovian conditioning are different. Pavlovian conditioned responses are typically reflexive in nature, as I was saying before, or changes in emotional or motivational states, not voluntary behavior. Salivation is not a voluntary response by dogs, but rather a reflexive response. Operant responses, on the other hand, are typically voluntary responses such as lever pressing, riding a bicycle, verbal behavior, and covert behavior, like thinking. Okay? Two-factor theory of learning comes into play when we're talking about using both classical and operant conditioning. Okay? And going back to this slide, let's talk a little bit more about this. Okay? So let's go back to talking a little bit more about what I was talking about earlier, the biology student who's had the cesarean section. This was originally presented to illustrate the Pavlovian conditioning through pairing the frightening experience at the hospital, the medicinal odors became the CS that triggered a fear response. Okay, fear or emotion. Fear is reflex and emotion, right? So that's Pavlovian. Operant conditioning also occurred, however. Since fear is unpleasant, any responses that reduce or eliminate fear are strengthened through negative reinforcement. When the young woman avoided the biology lab, she was operating on her environment to alleviate her fear. The student's avoidance behavior kept her from the biology lab, and since she was never exposed to the laboratory long enough to find out that the UCS would not occur, her conditioned fear was maintained. So her avoidance behavior involved two factors. The first being the acquisition of a conditioned fear to the medicinal odor, and the second being the operant avoidance response that was maintained by negative reinforcement. Okay, so the first thing is that emotional reflex response of the odor, meaning fear. And then the second thing came into play, which was the voluntary response, her decision to avoid the biology lab as a negative reinforcement for getting rid of that scenario and environment that caused the fear. Okay, that's two-factor learning. So let's talk a little bit more about some contemporary views of learning that more and more we're understanding that while classical and operant conditioning can explain a lot of learning, there's also a lot of belief that these are too mechanistic of an interpretation for all forms of learning. Okay? So cognitive learning theory is a theoretical perspective that attempts to study the role of thinking and memory processes in learning. So cognitive theorists stress the individual's the individual's active participation in the learning process. They suggest that we learn by forming a cognitive structure in memory that preserves and organizes information pertaining to the key elements in a situation. So in addition to forming conditioned associations between stimuli and behavior and reinforcement, we form mental representations of our environments. Okay? So here we have latent learning, which is learning that is not demonstrated by an immediately observable change in behavior. These include things like mazes, directions, and learning new material. Okay? And then we also have a cognitive map, which is an internal representation of the relationship between events or spatial elements. Cognitive maps have become a very important concept in contemporary learning theory. research suggests that a variety of organisms, including rats, chimps, birds, and bees, use cognitive maps in adapting to their environments. And humans also create mental representations of their environments, right, that allow them to function more effectively. Okay, and here's a graph of the experiment of classic latent learning, okay? So 3 groups of rats were run for 16 consecutive days in this complex maze, okay? An error was recorded each time a rat entered a blind alley in the maze. Rats in one group, the reinforcement group, received food when they reached the goal box at the end of the maze. Okay, here we go. They received food on each of the 16 days of the experiment when they got there. Then we have a second group, which is the non-reinforcement group. They also explored the maze each day, however did not receive food when they reached the end. Then we have rats in a third group, the latent learning group, who received no reinforcement for the first 10 days and then were reinforced for the remaining 6 days. So what's really interesting was that on the first 10 days, obviously the rats in the reinforcement group showed considerably more improvement than animals in either of the other groups. Okay? Animals in the non-reinforcement group showed very little improvement. However, after food was introduced on day 11 for rats in the latent learning group, they immediately began to perform as well as animals in the reinforcement group. This occurrence clearly demonstrated that Tolman's rats were learning something about the maze even with no reinforcement. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about cognitive maps. Couple different theories here. First one is observational learning theory. This is a learning process wherein an individual requires a behavior by observing someone else performing that behavior, also known as modeling, which we already talked about. Okay? Social learning theory is a theory that emphasizes the role of observation in learning. This experiment is referring to Bandura had adults come in and punch a Bobo doll with children observing this. And the children who observed this aggressive behavior were more likely to act aggressively when placed in the same situation. Not that surprising, okay? And Bandura identified 4 key steps in observational learning. Our attention is drawn to a modeled behavior. We store a mental representation of the behavior in our memories. A specific type of situation triggers us to convert the remembered observation into action. And if our actions are reinforced, we add this behavior to our repertoire of responses. Okay? It's really important stuff to remember if you have little kids or you're thinking about having kids. This is really good information to know. Okay, so biological basis of learning. So in order to really start to understand what's happening here, the biology in learning, investigating the mechanisms of learning in humans or even rats is just not practical because of the extremely large number of neurons involved. As we learned in Chapter 3, the human brain contains more than 100 billion neurons. So researchers have focused on another species with a relatively simple nervous system in order to help figure out what's happening in learning. So this is the Aplysia, which is a shellless marine snail. They only have about 20,000 neurons, and many of these connections, synapses, have already been well studied. Okay, so what's been learned here? Let's talk about the experiment a little bit first here. So we're going to talk about Eric Kandel and Pavlovian conditioning. So what they focused on was a protective reflex of the gill, which is the respiratory organ, okay? So when the aplysia is touched strongly on the tail or the siphon, the gill withdraws into the mantle, okay? I'm going to skip ahead here and see if we can get to our little diagram. Here we go. Okay, so here's our little marine shellless snail, okay? Because the protective response is easily observed and occurs reliably, it is an ideal response for Pavlovian conditioning. To condition a gill withdrawal response, a mild touch squirt of water is applied to the siphon. This mild touch by itself does not cause a gill withdrawal response. Immediately following the CS, which is the mild touch, a shock is applied to the tail, which is the UCS, and this does cause the gill to withdraw. After a number of paired touch shock trials, the siphon squirt resulted in a conditioned gill withdrawal response. Okay, not surprising. So what they figured out is they've identified several cellular changes that occur. The neurons involved are illustrated in these figures here. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. So in this figure, you can see that the modulatory neuron also has contact with the CS neuron. Notice that the synapse is at the end of the axon before its synapse with the motor neuron. If the CS neuron was recently active, because the CS was presented before the UCS, chemical events involving the neurotransmitter serotonin occur on both the presynaptic membrane of the CS neuron and on the postsynaptic motor neuron. After several conditioning trials, this chemical activity leaves the CS neuron facilitated and the postsynaptic motor neuron strengthened or potentiated. That is, the CS nerve terminal is now more permeable to calcium, and the postsynaptic motor neuron fires more easily. As you recall from chapter 3, calcium is involved in the release of the neurotransmitter into a synapse. Okay? When more calcium flows into the nerve terminal, more neurotransmitter is released. Therefore, the next time the CS occurs without the UCS, the activity of the CS neuron results in more neurotransmitter being released at the motor neuron synapse. If sufficient neurotransmitter is released from the CS neuron, the motor neuron will now fire, causing the gill withdrawal response. The withdrawal response to the mild siphon touch is now a conditioned response. So in summary, paired presentations of the CS and UCS leave the CS neuron facilitated and the postsynaptic neuron potentiated. Synaptic facilitation and long-term potentiation allow the CS to activate the motor neuron for the gill response. Okay? Oops. Hold on there, buddy. Oh boy. Let's skip on ahead here. I did it again. Okay, so let's go back to quickly here. Here we go. Okay, so synaptic facilitation is an increase in the size of the postsynaptic potential to a weak stimulus, resulting from neuronal changes that underlie learning and memory. And long-term potentiation is an increase in the neuron's sensitivity to fire following a burst of signals to that neuron's dendrites. Okay, so that's what's happening. That's how these conditioning responses are taking place on a nervous system level with the neurotransmitters activating. Okay, so that's it, guys, for this chapter. Hopefully you learned something, and there's a discussion question waiting for you. And take your quiz, and I hope you have a really great week. Okay, take care.